To those who have been excluded by Christians, to those who have gone to church their whole life, and to those who are exploring, welcome. We hope that Oak Life Church can be a home for you. If you have been rejected by the church as a person of color, as a woman, as an LGBT person, as a non-Christian, or for any other reason, we're sorry for the way you were treated. We believe that God loves you, and we would be honored by your presence. We'll tell you a little about ourselves, and we hope we can journey together. We hope to love people the way Jesus does. We don't want to judge. We want marginalized people to be welcome here, and we are still improving as an inclusive place. We long for peace and justice on earth. We build this through community service, generosity, and activism. We value community, and we value building supportive relationships with each other. We love creativity, and we love the way God speaks to us through art. We don't claim to know the truth fully, but we seek to follow Jesus, and we seek to grow together. If these are things you connect to, come visit us. We hope you will share with us who you are and help shape our community. With much love, Oak Life Church.
I botched it already. Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris, and this is a sermon re-record of this last Sunday's message. We had some tech difficulties, and a few people asked if we could share the resources. So I thought I'd just re-record some of the thoughts and the notes and the reflection. This is for anybody who wants that. And if not, that's not you, no worries. But if you're watching live with us, feel free to say what's up in the chats, and I'll engage a little bit if we can. The hope of this is to kind of talk us through some of what we talked through on Sunday in a way that is less clunky or doesn't have the glitches. So on Sundays, we have been in a conversation called Remember, where we are trying to remember things that we often forget. We've talked about remembering who God is, remembering the land, remembering awe and wonder. There's a lot of things in our world as humans that we just kind of overlook, or that get drowned out, or that we forget. We're a very forward-thinking culture. And we often don't look back to remember the lessons of the past, which are very, very important. So that's kind of the theme that we've been working with. And this week, we switched the topic last minute in light of some of the stuff that was going on in the world. There was a series of 3 mass shootings, which caught the headlines in Buffalo, in Southern California, and then finally in Texas. And for me, this was like a pretty emotional week. And I dropped my kids off at daycare on Wednesday. The shooting in Texas was Tuesday, and I tried to avoid the news as best I could and just kind of distance myself from it. As a new father, it's amazing how much anything that has to do with harm of children creates like a visceral response in me, and I can't help but get activated, feel extremely stressed. And I think each of us, maybe these different events we connect to in different ways. I know many of my friends in the African-American community with the shooting in Buffalo, it just like there's a lack of safety. There's almost a traumatic response that comes up in us. And so I was avoiding the news, dropping off my kids. And instead of turning on the news, when I get back in the car, I turned on ESPN or Sports Talk. And the first thing I heard was Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, giving a very impassioned speech, obviously emotional and angry and filled with grief and rage around the loss of these kids, these children, and also just angry that our country isn't doing more to respond to this. And I think for me, that just opened it up and I lost it. Just felt completely overwhelmed. And then going back to the talk I was writing that day, I realized I can't say what I had planned on saying. It just doesn't feel true for me in this moment. And so I went to our faith stories and I went to God and was trying to wrestle with this and felt very prompted to do a reflection on the way of peace, that among the many things we need to remember, one of them is peace in a world that is so violent, where there are shootings, it seems like every week. How do we, as people of faith, as people trying to follow Christ, how do we respond to that? And I think we need to remember that we follow the Prince of Peace, and that the ways of Christ are often very different and antithetical to the ways of the world, which prefer violence and power and domination, and not surrender and sacrifice, nonviolence and peace. And so as we opened up our conversation, I thought an appropriate way to do that would be to spend a moment in reflection through almost like a meditative, contemplative moment. In the Western Church, we've lost a lot of connection to the visual when it comes to worship. Maybe we have it in some ways with like flashy lights and stuff, but traditionally icons, stained glass, those sorts of things always played a significant role in the church. Even if you go to the Eastern Church today, you might walk in and immediately be confronted by icons, images that help us remember the truth of love, of reality, of God. And one of the ways to worship is to meditate on an icon, to reflect on an image. And art often can fill in the gaps when we don't have words, when we don't know what to say. It can actually say the things that are more true than our words or arguments, our verbal noise can articulate. And so I'd like for us to meditate on an image. I'll bring it up here and then explain it. This is called Christ Breaks the Rifle. It is a woodcut portrayal of Jesus breaking a gun that was painted in the 1950s by an artist named Otto Pankow. Otto was a well-established artist when Hitler came to power in 1933, but he was thereafter declared a degenerate artist because his central theme was the suffering of the oppressed. His pictures were seized from museums and art shops, and he became destitute, barely surviving the war. By the 1950s, however, he was a professor at Dusseldorf Academy of Fine Arts, where he created this woodcut, Christ Breaks the Rifle, which was created in part as part of the German movement against remilitarization after the horrors of World War II. So take a moment to let this image speak to you. Reflect on the past few weeks, in particular the mass shootings, and maybe even, if you need to, some of the geopolitical conflict and wars going on in the world. And listen for what God might be saying to you, where Jesus might be meeting you, meeting our world in the midst of this. I'll go off the screen for a moment and then come back on in another second. Going to bring us out of this visual meditation with the reading of Scripture. Micah 4:3 reads, "He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." In the Gospel of Matthew 26. This is the moment where Jesus was betrayed, confronted by a mob that would soon execute him as a criminal. The words were barely out of his mouth when Judas, the one of the 12, showed up, and with him a gang from the high priests and religious leaders brandishing swords and clubs. The betrayer had worked out a sign with them. "The one I kiss, that's the one. Seize him." He went straight to Jesus, greeted him. "How are you, Rabbi?" and kissed him. Jesus said, "Friend, why this charade?" Then they came on him, grabbed him, and roughed him up. One of those with Jesus pulled his sword, taking a swing at the chief priest's servant, cut off his ear. Jesus said, "Put your sword back where it belongs. All who use swords are destroyed by swords. Don't you realize that I am able to right now to call on my Father, and 12 companies more, if I want them, of fighting angels would be here battle ready? But if I did that, how would the scriptures come true that say it had to be this way?" Matthew 26:47-54. As you consider that painting and these words of scripture, if there's a word or a phrase or an impression, feel free to put it in the comments, some way this is speaking to you. Both of these images communicate, I think, beautifully the heart of God, which transforms weapons of violence and death into tools for resources and community and life. Right? We saw that image of Christ breaking the rifle. And as I saw that image, things that strike me, I'll bring that one back up just for a moment. What strikes me is Jesus's head. I feel like grief, like power and grief. He's powerful enough to break the violence, to break our weapons, but grieves the fact that these things even needed to exist. As I think about that passage from Micah, it's so beautiful and eloquent, and it's describing the hope of God, that God's trajectory for reality, for history, for our history, the hope for the world is that God would take our tools of violence and transform them to tools of community and sustenance and provision and peace. And we see this personified finally in Jesus in these final moments of his life before he's to be crucified, where a mob came at him, and some scholars would argue maybe hundreds of people came to Jesus because he was such a threat. And in response, he does not respond with violence, even though there's an impulse to do so. He says to Peter, "Hey, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Put your sword away. That's not what I've come to do." And so both of these passages, I think, speak to the heart of God in these moments, what God is about. God is about peace. God's about healing. God is not a vindictive, violently redemptive God, but God is God who desires for tools of violence to be transformed for his own sake, right? In the Christ moment, Jesus does not respond with violence, but actually responds with surrender, with love and forgiveness, which overcomes the violence of our times. And so I want to wrestle with this, right? I want to play with this because our culture has missed this hope of Christ. I think especially as people of faith in America, we have often aligned ourselves more with the militarization of America, with guns, with protection of the Second Amendment, than we have with the Jesus of the Bible, who, in my opinion, would never even own a gun, who took up a cross, which was an act of self-surrender rather than an act of power and domination over others. And so just a quick word on these two images. If you didn't know what a plowshare was, it's a common word in Christian circles historically. It is a common refrain. There's actually some nonprofits that are called like the Plowshare Foundation and so forth. And the idea is to take swords or tools of violence and beat them into something that would be a use for farming and agriculture. If you're like me, you didn't really grow up with plowshares. These were tools and are tools used by farmers to cut the ground in order to soften it and cultivate it for crops. They're carried behind animals and dragged through the dirt. Plowshares are metal blades used for non-violent purposes to help provide for the needs of the community. This passage is found like the one we read here in Micah 4:3, but also Isaiah 2:4, where we see the prophetic literature paint a picture of God's hopes and purposes for the world. Essentially, God's desire is for God's children to have peace, and again, that our swords, whatever those may be, would be transformed into devices that serve the common good. And I think you see this echoed in Jesus, and he says, hey, if I took up the sword, the words about me wouldn't be fulfilled. And I think he's referring to resonant passages like Micah and Isaiah. Well, then fast forward to the events of recent weeks of the last 20 years in America. I still remember being in Miss Usdom's history class, watching on TV, this is before flat screens, one of those like big TVs that's up in the corner, the news, the live news of the Columbine shooting, as kids, students, were running from an active shooter. I wish that was the end of the story. We maybe could have learned a lesson. What ends up happening in response is America responds to swords with swords. A few thousand years after Jesus experienced that moment and said, all who die by the sword, all who live by the sword die by the sword, we still take up our swords, except now they're even more powerful than ever. One thing that happens after each one of these shootings, tragically, is that gun sales rise. People are afraid that our government's going to take away our guns. So people either buy more because they think there might be a scarcity, or they buy more in self-defense. And so we flood our communities with more killing machines. Across the nation, gun sales have rocketed after most of these shootings. In 2020, gun sales were at an all-time high. And let me remind you that these swords, these modern day swords, their purpose is to kill. That's the intent of these things. And to me, that seems deeply incongruent with the Jesus of scriptures, who practiced nonviolence resistance, who overcame evil with good, and who, again, whose desire was to embody the Micah vision for reality, that those tools would be transformed into tools of sustenance for everyone. And so we have some stuff to work through. We need to think through this one. We need to process and unpack. Because I think underneath it all is actually this tension, the spiritual war between fear and faith. See, I understand the sentiment, the fear that there's danger in a world, so we have to do something to protect ourselves. And I get that. I've got kids and I think about these things, but I think our answer has so overcompensated, is so driven by fear that we end up making it worse in the end. The reality is most of the things that we need to be afraid of aren't significant dangers to most of us, though those who benefit from the sales of killing machines would want us to believe otherwise. And so the military industrial complex, the arms industry, takes advantage of this fear, this very natural fear, and sells us products for more security, sells us products to convince us that we will be more safe in the end. And there's actually good data that in the end, the fact that you own a gun increases your likelihood of being hurt or harmed or having somebody else harmed by the gun. The second you own a gun, you're more likely to be harmed, most likely by that gun, whether it's in a moment of mental crisis or an accident. And so we've missed this opportunity to be people of faith. So what does it mean for us in these moments of horror, of tragedy? Well, I think we have a choice. Do we run in the lane of faith, or do you run in the lane of fear? And the lane of fear has been, I think, our lane mostly for the last, since America's rise. Here's my observation, and it's echoed by many people who actually, maybe I'm echoing their observation. Violence always begets more violence. Responding to violence out of fear and self-protection and wanting to harm the other person or do violence in result, it always just begets more violence. Like Jesus said, if living by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. Dr. King said that violence always begets more violence. And this has been emphatically, empirically true over our history. Did you know that in the United States, we've been at war? I have to update this stat every couple of years. We've been in some sort of armed conflict overseas 229 out of the last 246 years of our existence. That means that if you pick any year in our history, there's a 94% chance we will have been engaged in some sort of violent conflict. And every time we go down that path of violence, we choose to respond to a danger with fear and violence. We're somehow promised that in the end we'll be less violent, but it actually makes it worse. We're feeding the beast. Even this year, it's so common that we've become numb to it. The Ukraine conflict has made us more aware of some of our overseas geopolitical conflicts. But the truth is, we've been engaged in a war in Syria, even while Afghanistan dwindled down, which was another war, a military debacle. We've been dropping bombs in places like Syria and Yemen. This year in January, 6 children and 4 women were among people killed by a U.S. Special Operations Forces launch in the Idlib province of Syria. Did we even know that? No, we're so numb to our violence overseas and we disconnect that from our violence at the homeland. We think there's some non-correlation. The reality is violence is everywhere. We're propagating it. We're propelling it. We're magnifying it. And a lot of this is based in this fundamental question of, are we being people who live by faith or fear? As Christians, I think we have to remember the words of Scripture, which says perfect love drives out all fear. We have to catch it when people are trying to manipulate fear to get us to move towards violence. I think Jesus could have taken things into his own hand at that moment where he's taken by the mob. So I'm going to protect myself and protect my people. But he ultimately surrendered to something bigger than himself and stepped into the path of faith, of embodied faith. So yeah, I'm just seeing it all around. We're a violent country. We have normalized violence abroad, and we become numb to it here. And the industry, which profits off of that, which is, multidimensional, the arms industry, the military-industrial complex, I would argue, militant and the militarization of local police and even politics have exploited that fear that something could happen to us and sold us protection, which has actually created more violence in the end and made us less safe. The more we flood our nation and the world with guns, the more likely we will see them be used for evil. The more we normalize violence overseas, the more we will reap what we sow at home. Violence always begets more violence. If you sow a culture of killing, death, an incredibly profitable gun industry, make no mistake, we will reap what we sow. And this is ultimately driven by fear as a way to profit from those violence. Did you know, just as a random stat, I was looking this up this week, a lot of the military bills, I'll talk about this in a sec, the military's, the US government's increase of spending in defense, a lot of the bills that spend money on weaponry, tanks, missiles, bombs, whatever they are, often written into those bills is a clause that says if there's leftovers or there's stuff being underutilized, it can go to local policing. So we think we're spending money on military stuff overseas to keep us safe from these bad guys. But what we end up often doing is spending it to militarize our own people. Did you know that Alameda County, closely tied into OPD, the Alameda County Sheriff and OPD, own a tank called the Grizzly? Look it up. Why do we need a tank to police our streets? Have we gotten safer owning that tank? I would posit, no, we haven't. And again, underneath it all is this temptation to find safety and security in a gun rather than the invitation to have faith that God will protect us, that we can work through this together, can move into the way of peace, and we take things into our own hands. There's a great book called God and Guns, which I'll show a picture of in just a moment. But in the book, they quote this: the gun is a temptation to become a kind of powerful self with the capacity to kill instantaneously. This is an arrogation of power that the New Testament's witness does not support. And I agree with the author. I think the example of Jesus, I think the sentiment of Micah and Isaiah is that we're not supposed to be people who take up violent killing machines. Now, I think there's nuance with what self-defense means, but in what world is it okay to have AR-15 sold in every corner, and especially as people of faith? How do we reconcile the nonviolence of Jesus, who carried a cross, with the impulse for more and more weapons, more and more guns? This is the most confusing part to me, that how so many Christians can be supportive of all this. How can you look at Christ, sense Christ's heart, and not hear and sense Christ being grieved, and think it's okay that in our country we have more guns than people? That is a very anti-Christian stat, in my opinion. So what does it mean to be people of faith in this moment? I have a couple thoughts here. I said this on Sunday, and maybe I should have collected my thoughts more, but sorry if some of this is rambling and venting, but it's just my initial thoughts and reactions to all this. And I know there might be disagreement here, but I I think we should at least hold it in tension and consider how to not forget the way of peace. So a couple thoughts, actually 4 thoughts. How do we be people of peace in the midst of moments like this? I think first, we have to watch out for the myth of redemptive violence, which is everywhere. The myth of redemptive violence is the idea that when one of us is wronged, or when there's violence that happens to us, the right thing to do is to respond in kind. Or it could be preemptive violence, that violence will solve things. This is, resonant with the idea of revenge, with quid pro quo, with mutually assured destruction, even with offensive military operations where we think we're doing something to defend something that could potentially happen locally or abroad. I believe that violence is never redemptive. Sometimes violence is final, right? You can kill somebody, you can end the thing, but usually that sows a seed for further violence and trauma. It is not the path of Jesus. And there's a myth everywhere that it is. I was just talking with somebody at lunch about this, that like all of our shows and movies are about the celebration of redemptive violence. You kill the bad guy and save the good guy. And that's the story. What we don't see is a story of people of peace getting into the trenches of life with folks and working slowly towards healing and restoration and redemption. Because again, violence can end things, but it doesn't redeem things. I think in the cross, somebody brought this up on Sunday, that the cross has been distorted to be a justification for violence. But I think what it is a cancellation of violence. It's Jesus saying, hey, throw it all on me. I'm not going to respond in kind. I'm going to let you do violence to me and show you that my love is bigger than that. And then this is not the way. This is not what God does. God does not operate with redemptive violence. God operates with grace and compassion and forgiveness and sacrifice. Healing comes from things like accountability and empathy and forgiveness and structures that lead towards equity and human rights. Healing doesn't come from violence. It's antithetical. Healing, just on a biological level, is ingredients which offer a wound to restore, right? If you do more violence to the wound, it makes it worse. And I believe Jesus is an anti-hero in this way, that our world celebrates those who are okay with violence as a way to redeem the moment and show their strength and not de-escalate, right? We've seen a few examples of this over time, the folks like Gandhi and Dr. King and so forth. These are people of peace, or at least trying to operate non-violently and work through the nuance of that. I've seen this in the Ukraine situation. We are so obsessed in the West with Zelensky, right? And maybe there's merit to it, whatever. But I also wonder if we aren't perpetuating the myth of redemptive violence, that, hey, this thing is happening, we got to respond to war with more war. I mean, thousands of people are dying. Nonviolent solutions weren't fully explored or embraced. And we celebrate the John Wayne, Superman, Batman kind of characters, which underneath them is at least sprinkled with, tangled with, influenced by what I would say is toxic masculinity, which goes to violence as a way to solve things. This is everywhere. It's so common. I was just on Saturday, we had a birthday party for my nephew, and he's 8 and my oldest son is 4. And this idea of violence just being so normalized is the first time my son held a Nerf gun. And, it's likely innocent, but I couldn't help but look at it and wrestle with wait, a gun, what do we do with that? But, Nerf guns sell way more than social worker toys or doctor toys, right? This idea that the violence is positive and fun. One of the images I like of that first painting we looked at, one of the things I like about it is that I sense grief. Violence is a part of our world, but it should never be seen through the light of redemption, of celebration. When it does happen, there should be grief and loss and sadness. And so even, celebrating our heroes that are violent, I think a proper way to look at them is sadness, that there's violence in the world and they felt like they had to respond with more violence. So the first thing is we got to look out for that myth of redemptive violence. We got to catch it, because I think our story is one of peace, restoration, reconciliation. And if that myth of redemptive violence is, getting its tentacles into Christianity, I think we have to catch it and call it out. Second, we need to acknowledge that the US is sick. We are a sick country addicted to guns. But you've probably seen the stats over and over. Like, all the Western countries don't have this issue. All the global countries, for that matter, don't have this issue. What's the difference? Guns. We have so many of them. Those who are able to access them, who are in a space of mental instability or are in a crisis moment or for whatever reason, find the pursuit of a gun necessary for their spot they're in, they can find one easily. And the scale at which they can do damage is more than any other country in the world, because an 18-year-old can go out and buy an AR-15 without many background checks, without many checks on mental health, without needing to get permission or get checked. There's so many things there, right? So we're sick. We love guns. It's deeply embedded in our Constitution, in our narrative, our mythology. So I want to read a quote for you that I think captures how sick we are, how much we miss the mark. This comes from an article called No Way Out But War by Christopher Hedges. Highly recommend his work. He says, permanent war has cannibalized our country, the country. It has created a social, political, and economic morass. Each new military debacle is another nail in the coffin of Pax Americana. The United States, as the near unanimous vote to provide nearly $40 billion in aid to Ukraine illustrates, is trapped in the death spiral of unchecked militarism. No high-speed trains, no universal health care, no viable COVID relief program, no respite from 8.3% inflation, no infrastructure programs to repair decaying roads and bridges, which will require $41 billion to fix the 43,000 structurally deficient bridges, on average 68 years old. No forgiveness of 1.7 trillion in student debt, no addressing income equality, no program to feed the 17 million children who go to bed each night hungry, no rational gun control curbing the epidemic of nihilistic violence and mass shootings, no help for the 100,000 Americans who die each year of drug overdoses, no minimum wage of $15 an hour to counter the 44 years of wage stagnation, no respite from gas prices that are projected to hit $6 a gallon. Right? We could solve so many of our problems that would, in the end, prevent more harm done to our people, would take care of us. We could turn our swords into plowshares just in how we spend our money, right? Money can be a weapon. And over, our political climate, our culture, our country has chosen to spend on war, to spend on tools of death and destruction and killing, when we could be spending those resources on things that bring about good and healing and restoration. So we need to acknowledge that the US is sick. If you want to read more on this one, here's a couple books that I highly recommend. One is God and Guns by Dr. Christopher Hayes, and the other one is Postcards from Babylon by Brian Zahn. So we got to watch out for the myth of redemptive violence. It's a myth. It's a lie. We got to acknowledge that the US is sick, that we've got a problem here. Next, we need to remember that community is a matter of life and death. In these moments, there is an impulse to retreat. When we live in fear, there's an impulse to run from all the bad people out there, find ways to protect myself, and isolate. And I think one of the weapons that we have as followers of Christ is to move into community in a way that offers connection and regulation and comfort and hope, just friendship for that matter. I was talking with a youth pastor last week around all this, and they were saying like they couldn't help but think about even the shooters in some of these situations and how they got there, how we could have prevented that. And somewhere along the line, we failed them, right? I know that's a hyperbolic story, an extreme story, but the reality is mental health is a massive crisis, and a lot of it stems from our isolation. So much of the tools of regulation and community were taken away from us during the pandemic. And I know that even for me, like I've got great support, and I had some really dark days and still do. And I find that just knowing there's other people reminding me I'm not alone, that I'm loved, makes a huge difference. And we're talking about this in There's lots to critique around youth ministry or church and community, like all that. But the amount of good that is done by having community it's hard to measure, but I know that the ripple effects of it have an impact on eternity. That many people have felt comfort and safety and belonging just by being together with others, and has prevented them from going down a dark spiral, has allowed some sense of togetherness and community. And so community, it really is, to me, a matter of life and death. Having relationships with others is not a afterthought. It is a foundational thing that we all need, which was made so hard during the pandemic. And so I think one of the ways we have to respond in moments like this is to not let the fear of others, the fear of other things dominate us, but to move into faith and try to create spaces of belonging and togetherness and community, reflecting the family of God. Right? I think this is one thing that happens for a lot of us. We get into church, we're used to it, we kind of get what we need, and then it's not so much as like a novelty anymore. And we think maybe I don't need it as much. And I think that's beautiful and good. I think that in some ways there's merit to that, because many of us were guilted into going to church, and then a space like Oak Life comes along and you realize you don't have to be there every Sunday. You can take your time. You can ease in, ease out as you need to, and God still loves you. And so many of us with that freedom feel a sense of freedom, just that. And I love that. And I support that. But I also think we need to remember that church isn't just about us. Community isn't just about what we get out of it, but the togetherness, the community, the safety, the hope, the restoration, the goodness, the love that we get to create together. And so just a thought for all of us, like whoever ends up watching this, maybe community is about others. There's that person in the room who is alone today, who needs just to be looked at with compassion, who needs to know there's somebody else in the room. Presence is important. Being present with other people is a weapon of peace. Just being with people, which is what we see in Jesus over and over. He moves into the mess, incarnates into human history, spends day and night with us, doesn't isolate up on a hill for us to go and try to strive to get to, but comes right to us in the midst of it all. So how do we respond as people of faith? We got to watch out for the myth of redemptive violence, acknowledge that America is sick, remember that community is a matter of life and death, and finally, never stop striving for peace. Look, it is so easy to get discouraged. It's so easy to fall into despair and feel like, man, there's nothing we could do. We can do stuff. I think community alone, just one idea there is significant. We can do so much. We need to be people who are galvanized by peace, who are militant about peace. We need more soldiers of grace, mercy, and compassion in our world, people who are radicalized by love. That's what our world needs. As one author puts it, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. How do we as people make hope possible? Well, we do it. We heal together. We show the world that we will not be defeated by fear. We live into faith. We love each other well. We create communities where there's human thriving, and it gives hope to others. If we don't, those who want to profit off of despair and fear will convince us otherwise. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. 2 examples of this, and I'm almost done. The first is a picture on the left of the screen. This is a refugee camp in northern Syria called Al-Hol, and it's a place where despair seems pretty convincing. This refugee camp is housing largely survivors of some of the most recent Middle East conflicts, which actually have their root in American militarism. But this refugee camp in particular houses family members of ISIS fighters, largely women and children who were victims of their predicament of being born where they were, who largely weren't responding to violence and violence, they're just trying to survive. And in this space of desolation, as their family members died, usually the fathers died in these conflicts, they have nowhere to go, and there's this refugee camp. That's where they end up. These people are a political hot potato. Turkey won't take them. Syria won't take them. The U.S. doesn't know what to do with them. Though, just a side tangent, we seem to know what to do with refugees if they are European. But if they're not, we don't know what to do with those, even though often we create the refugee crisis with our addiction to violence, redemptive violence, and that it's myth. So these people are there. Well, some locals who are there decided to help, right? To move and respond to violence with peace. And the way they did that is they provided hearing aids for kids. Many ways. There's also healthcare and education, but this story in particular is so compelling, it gets me emotional almost every time I think about it. A local there, I think he's Syrian, if not Syrian, from the region, asked a nonprofit that I'm part of to fund hearing aids. And so these doctors went in and gave children hearing aids. And most of these kids, for the better part of 5+ years, lived around violence, lived around the noises of exploding gunshots, bombs being dropped. And so most of them have hearing damage. Can you imagine that? You and all your friends not be able to hear well because all you've heard, like the sound of bombs and guns being normalized for kids anywhere in the world is so tragic. It's hell, right? This is evil. Well, how do they respond? Well, they respond with peace and healing and restoration, technology, compassion, presence, and they go in and they offer hearing aids to kids who need hearing, and they can hear for the first time. And I've seen videos of these kids light up. It's emotional. It's amazing. And there's at least one layer of violence's evil grip on their lives that is peeled back. Even if it's just one, it's worth it. These are the stories we have to normalize and move towards and embody. This is where I think Jesus is. This is what Jesus is doing in our world. How is Jesus responding to crisis? With healing and presence, holding the wounds, holding the pain, holding the trauma, bleeding alongside, offering resurrection in the end, hope in the end. The second picture on the right of the screen is a picture of what's become known as the Oakland ceasefire movement. This is a movement of evidence-based approach to reducing community gun violence, driven by a community partnership that includes clergy, street outreach, service providers, some law enforcement. They use data to look at the neighborhoods that are most at risk for violence and just be present there. They walk the neighborhoods, they knock on doors, they build relationships, they create a sense of safety just by being there and being visible, by not running from violence or responding to violence with violence, but by responding in peace and presence. And the early data showed that there was a significant increase to homicides and non-fatal shootings when this program was started in the first few years. Now, in the last couple of years, this started in, early 2010s. I don't have the exact date right here. But if you Google Oakland ceasefire program, you'll find it. Since the pandemic, those things have stalled out because, again, we're moving to isolation and we move away from each other rather than to community. And so some of these programs have stopped. And as violence has increased in our world, I hear this narrative over and over that the way we respond to violence is with more violence. We need to have more guns on the street, whether they're legal guns sanctioned by police departments. That's a whole different conversation, but that's the general sense. That's the political platform that's being more supported right now. And we're missing sight of how do we respond in peace? How do we respond by not supporting more tools of killing in our streets? How do we go and be present? I think both of these stories give us a picture of what it might look like. Through presence, relationship, through community, a refusal to add to the cycles of violence and always seek healing, to diffuse and de-escalate and understand and move in empathy, to not feed the trolls of our world with their vitriol, moving towards the hurting instead of outsourcing the hurting to a professional somewhere else, the problem somewhere else. This means we seek healing and peace and shalom wherever we're at. How do we do this kind of work that we just saw in these pictures in our own lives, in our own workplaces? How do we advocate for systems and laws which regulate and minimize violence and violent products? How do we catch the myth of redemptive violence out there and say, that's not the way the world is going to be fixed through violence? How do we critique what's becoming more and more common and popular, which is Christian militant nationalism at all costs, right? If you see Christians having a Jesus who holds an AR and holds an American flag, I can tell you right now, that is not the Jesus I've come to know. I got into trouble this week because I actually don't think the Second Amendment is fundamentally Christian. I don't think it is. I don't think the impulse to want and have a right to protect your right for killing machines can be squared, if you're a Christian, with the Jesus of the Bible who did not respond to violence with violence, but responded with the cross. Friends, I know this is messy, but I hope we can sense that God holds us in this pain. God is with us and inviting us to live into hope, faith, and love, even if it feels like despair wins the day. Our calling is to make peace possible, make hope possible, even when despair feels convincing. That's what being truly radical is. If you feel alone in this time, I hope you know you're never alone. God is with you. You are loved. God is proud of us. God wants to move us forward, while at the same time, God grieves where we miss the mark. I believe in a God who breaks the guns of our world. I believe in a God who disarms, destroys tools of killing and transforms them to resources for thriving in community. Let us not be caught in the myth of redemptive violence and the story which tells us we need guns to solve our problems. Let us move towards a way of peace. This is our way. As I close, I thought I could read a prayer. This is the prayer of St. Francis. Prayer of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Well, thanks for watching. If you were here, hope something was stirred in you. And wherever you're at on this conversation, I hope we can sense God's presence with us and catch a glimpse of the future, which God invites us to believe and live into, which is a future of peace, a future of Otto Hancock's picture, which I'll close with this. This is where God is in the midst of all it all. Amen.